Okay, well, thank you for being patient once again. I'm normally not someone who has a huge amount of problems with things like this, but here we are. So we're ironing out the details. I guess next week we'll try to hit the ground running with starting on time and taking attendance and all of that stuff. But suffice it to say, we're now going to dive into a little bit of economics material and see if we can discuss some of the course material. So I know a lot of you are new here for the first time. Pursuant to that, let me just kind of see if I can actually get on the old Top Hat site now. Here we go. If in fact you are new to class, I'll just kind of briefly remind you that if you go to Brightspace and you get the syllabus, you should then be able to find your way here to the course Top Hat site. All of the readings, everything you need to know is here. I'll use Brightspace for grades, that's about it, because the Top Hat grade book's a little clunky. But you can sort of go to this Top Hat site here and figure out everything you need to. Let's hope it loads. Starting to get a little nervous here. Everything you need to know is here. I'd like to, Top Hat it seems has changed a little bit, so now they don't have their student view, but hopefully you can get a feel for what I've assigned here. We have 4 chapters here. They're quick, they're easy to read. People have asked me about getting up and running with all the web stuff and the software and all that. It's not urgent right away to buy the software and everything. You can get a trial account for now. Next week I'm going to start, I see there's about 68 people signed up of 110 or so. I'm going to start poking you and saying, hey, come on, it's time to get started here. The reason why I'm showing you this, well, of course we have our homework here, right? Both readings and homework on Top Hat, but also here's the course matrix, which I promised you I would populate as the course went on. So here are my lecture notes. There's a YouTube link to the first class. It's kind of it's one of these things where it's not, but you can see here, this is our first lecture. It's not the greatest video in the world, but the idea isn't, it's not for drama, it's for content, just to let you catch up to things if you happen to miss them and all that. Though maybe you can see I'm playing around with camera setups and all that stuff. I don't know why quite I do this, why I mess around with cameras and recording and all that stuff. I don't know. It's just one of these things that you do, and students seem to like it, particularly at certain times of the class. Anyways, so we're getting into Chapter 3, moving into Chapter 4 as assigned on Top Hat there. So you'll notice that there's the homework. Maybe I'll go back to that in a second, but that's everything there is for today. I'm just kind of thinking about what we're going to do. Oh, my office hours, I think, are posted on my syllabus. Oh, and we also have a TA, right, for the class, who I'll hopefully introduce to you next time, and we'll have some office hours for me. And also, I'm not going to talk about it today. There are 2 kind of types of homework. What I have in mind is that when you go through these chapters of the readings, maybe I'll just say it quickly here. When you go through the chapters of the readings, you'll notice that there's these questions here in the, there's already 42 responses there. You'll notice there's these questions here in the readings, so I guess a lot of you have figured this out already. I do look at those, but they're mainly participatory. I just check them to make sure that you've done them in good faith. And I don't grade them for correctness typically, but that's one type of homework that you can use. And the more formal homework, which is similar to what our exams will look like eventually, is here. Okay, I think that's all I have for the administrative crap for the day. So maybe we'll just dive into the lecture, and we'll start thinking a little bit about economics here on this cold Thursday morning here. So last time I introduced this basic idea behind economics, right, and this was essentially that decision makers are rational. Of course, that can mean a lot of things. So we can sort of think about who are decision makers and what does it mean to be rational. Well, very roughly, decision makers are anybody we want them to be when we're studying a particular problem, right? It could be a consumer, it could be a producer of a good, but it could also be a government or a family or an international conglomerate, right? It could be any one of these things. And when we say that these decision makers are rational, it means that we can clearly define what they're trying to do, and we can clearly define what it means to succeed or fail, right? This is a little bit more subtle than you might think, and I might tack on to that statement that we also assume these objectives are somewhat simple, right? And I'll give you some examples as we go through class here. We'll have two pretty good examples, I think. But really what we care about as economists are the observable consequences of making these assumptions, right? It's great to say these things, but then when we go out there and we watch people do whatever it is they do during the day, what does this mean for what we think of what they're doing, right? It means quite a bit, actually. So here's a good example. I go to the store here on campus and I buy a coffee, right? Well, what do you make of this? Well, an economist would look at this decision that I've made, and you would infer immediately that the coffee is more valuable to me at that moment than the money I gave up to get it, right? So this coffee, I don't know, $2 or whatever it is in the cafeteria, you would infer immediately that I've gained more than $2 in satisfaction, or I will gain more than $2 in satisfaction when I buy the coffee and consume it, right? You might also say, well, I didn't buy it at a deli, but if you suppose I did, you would also suppose then that they're selling this coffee at that price to me for a reason, right? Being rational. They're doing it because the money they get is more than what it costs them to make the coffee, right? So maybe they can make a cup of coffee for 15 cents, I don't know. They sell it for $2. I get $5, I don't know, of satisfaction out of the coffee. Of course, when we put that all together, both parties are gaining from this exchange, right? So I give up $2 to get $5 in value. They give up 15 cents of costs to get $2 in returns or revenues, right? So parties gain from exchange. That's one very simple inference we might make from this exchange, right? Or from just observing what happened. You might even push this further. There's a whole bunch of things I didn't do, right, that I could have done. I could have bought a coffee, over by the library, or I could have left the building. I didn't do any of those things. Why did I buy the coffee from the cafeteria? Well, you can think about all of the various costs and benefits I would have incurred had I made a different decision. I decided not to do that, right? All of this follows from the idea that what I'm doing is rational. So what we're going to do here is it's kind of it's a useful exercise in and of itself, but it's also this very simple exercise I have in mind, which gives you sort of the zeitgeist of economics, right? It'll sort of ease you into the whole idea of how we build what we call a model, right, in economics. That is some sort of technical apparatus for simplifying and understanding and maybe even manipulating a problem. And what we're going to do is discuss this thing called the production possibilities frontier, which is a very simple model. And what it is intended to do is model this phenomenon scarcity, right? This idea that we can't do everything and that we face trade-offs when we make decisions, right? Now, you may look at this and say, well, most of what Baker's doing is obvious, but I guess that's part of the usefulness of a model, is that things become very simple and organized, right? Our ways of thinking about things become very simple and organized, and maybe even some of the implications will be a little bit surprising. So I'm going to show you, it turns out that this model, in fact, a simplified version of our very simple model, was one of the first expositions of why trade is a good thing, right? I guess I could say trade is a good thing. So in some sense, I say here a spiritual experience. I don't know if that's kind of pushing it a little bit too far, but it is this introduction to thinking like an economist, right? A couple things. It's a very simple two-dimensional graph, right? I mention this because the real world is very complicated, and you might say, well, what good is a graph with an x and a y axis? And I would say, well, it turns out we can almost always specialize our problems so that they fit in this situation. And of course, I think I mentioned that this is capturing simple ideas using formal tools. So it's kind of, one thing I'll just parenthetically say here, I use the word spiritual experience. I don't know if that's the right, I should have asked ChatGPT if that was the right way to say it. But it kind of is. And this is one thing I learned during the pandemic, that there's just something to be said for all of us being here. It's so we're sort of like, I don't know if it's like going to church, but we're here together talking about economics 2 hours a week, and there's, I think I mentioned if you came in a little late, I was kind of talking about, why we force ourselves to come here and talk about economics. Anyways. Okay, so modeling here. When I sort of think about what I might, I've made kind of little economic models of all sorts of crazy things. What you usually do, or how you might kind of think about the process, is you start with a very simple example, right? Start with a simple example, something that you understand, that you can kind of, organize your thinking around. So I'm going to start with a little factory, a simple factory example to understand this phenomenon. And then we're going to develop a little intuition as to how the problem works. And then once we understand our particular example and problem, we're going to say, well, is this a general idea, right? What is, or put another way, what is general about this idea? Generalize, right? And then what we can do is we can sort of say, all right, well, can we move this example around? Can we, Baker's going to talk about a factory, but can we talk about other things? Can we talk about production in a country, or on a deserted island when there's only one person, or different kinds of factories? I don't know. And then oftentimes what you want to do is say, okay, well, what are the limitations, right? How is my example limited? What are the crucial limitations, I might say? Right? You might say, well, if Baker, he's going to talk about a world in which there's 2 things the factory can make. What if it could make 4 things or 10 things, right? Would that change the basic idea, right? If not, what would? So, okay. So here's my example. It's a factory, simple factory, somewhere in Brooklyn maybe, I don't know. And so what we're going to do is we're going to assume that your factory already has contracts for all of, that's paid for. You have workers that come to work there. You have raw materials, machinery, all of those things. So we're going to forget about all that. We're just going to say you have a lump of stuff in your factory, right? And then what you want to do is make something with it. So your factory maybe is set up to make bikes, right? If it's Brooklyn, maybe they're Fixies, or, people still ride those, the Fixies? No? Is anybody, I don't know. Okay. So you might say, how many bicycles can we make in a year? Might be one of the first questions you ask. And so maybe you come up with a number, you can make 14 million in a year. All right, what does that mean? Okay, maybe you do what people usually do when they own factories, and they, you do some research, and then you say, well, if we stagger shifts, I don't know, I made all this up, so these are just buzzwords that I threw in there to sound official. Parallel production, I don't know, optimize this, do that. Maybe you can squeeze $15 million out of 15 million bikes, out of your factory when you're at capacity. Okay, great, so you're cranking out some bikes, but maybe one day you do a little extra research and you figure out that you can make phones too, right? You've learned that it's not so hard to make smartphones, and all the stuff you have laying around. Some of the workers and maybe you have a software engineer, I don't know. But you figure out that you can take these, you can take your resources and shuffle them around and maybe make phones. So it turns out you could probably make 1 million phones, and you do some research and you say, well, if we do phones, that's pretty clear. Here comes the trade-off, right? It's pretty clear we won't be able to make as many bikes as we were before, right? If only because we're using some of the labor and all that stuff to make phones that we were using to make bikes. So you figure out that if you make 1 million phones with your stuff, you can make 14 million bikes. So your production goes from 15 to 14 million bikes, but you get 1 million phones in the bargain. You then observe, this is kind of a fast one I'm pulling on you here, to sneak in a principle of economics. If you push production from 1 million to 2 million phones, you observe that, well, now bike production falls to 12 million bikes. So you now are starting to get a feel for a trade-off here. You can make 15-0, 14-1, or 12-2. Those are combinations of bikes and phones. So you might immediately say, Baker, what the hell's going on here? Why is it the case that we were able to get 1 million phones and only give up 1 million bikes, but then when we go to 2 million phones, we seemingly drop by 2 million bikes, right? I'll show you what this means if you don't quite understand what I said there. But it looks like we have to give up a lot more bikes for that second bunch of phones, right? Why is this the case? And in fact, why is this the case? It's not a mystery. We think of this as a general principle, right? And we will call this the principle of increasing costs. And the idea is kind of simple when you think about it in the context of my example. The idea is the very first thing we do when we decide to start making phones is we start with the low-hanging fruit. More on that in a second, right? So you say, well, you know, there's this stuff and that stuff and some rubber and blah, blah, blah that we couldn't fit into a bike. That's just laying around, so we might as well use it to, and that guy over there is just standing around. Why don't we just use that stuff to make some phones, right? The leftovers. We'll start there, right? Fine. Our software engineer could be a little bit busier. We'll use all that, right? So we use the easiest stuff to convert from bikes to phones first, yes? Well, when we decide to make another 1 million phones, well, then we have to sort of think, well, now we're going to have to dig into our bike production a little bit more seriously, right? You over there, you were making bikes, come over here and work on phones for a little while. And so we dig into our bike production more seriously when we start to make more phones. If we wanted to make even more phones, well, now the problem's getting even more severe, right? You know, and if we wanted to make nothing but phones, well, then we're really digging into our bike production. How are we going to use those spokes and the guy who knows all about fixies to make phones? Yes, a question.
Yeah, so how would you make a positive trade-off?
Oh.
What would make it a positive trade-off that as a CEO of the company, you're comfortable losing production
Oh.
on 2 million bikes to make 2 million phones?
Okay, so there's two aspects to that question. First of all, yes, there is always a trade-off, right? We're going to have to give up one thing to get more of another, right? If we're using our stuff in the best possible way. How we would pick how much of one thing we want to give up for another, we're going to leave that aside for the time being. It's a great question, right? But we're just going to think about this trade-off a little bit. And by the way, you might think about this as a general principle, right? This idea that doing more and more and more of one thing requires you to give up things that are progressively more valuable. So, for example, if we thought about a completely different example where I'm like sitting there I'm on a deserted island, right? And I can produce two things in my, you know, in the sunlight hours, right? Maybe let's say coconuts. What do I say? Coconuts and fish, right? I can spend all of my day gathering coconuts or all of my day fishing. Well, you might think of it this way. If I spend a couple hours in the morning, say, fishing, well, what I do is I just wade into the water and I grab the crabs and shellfish that are right there, you know. But if I wanted to get more fish, I'd have to go out into deeper waters or find different sorts of fish. Same is true of coconuts, right? The first thing I do when I gather coconuts is I take the lowest hanging coconuts. I was going to say the low hanging fruit, but I don't think coconuts are a fruit. Maybe they are, I don't know. Yeah, well, that's a good question. But I'll get the lowest hanging coconuts first, right? And if I want more, well, I'm going to have to climb higher on the tree. It gets harder and harder to produce more and more of this. So you might think of this as a general principle, but you know what? If your mind is kind of turning and you're saying, well, you know, Baker, I don't think that always applies because I can think of this situation where it doesn't. That's good, right? That's kind of what the idea is. You're sort of feeling out the limitations of this. And so here, I got ahead of my slides a little bit, but that's the general idea. But what we might want to do is take everything I've said here, and especially in light of the question about what the trade-offs are, and encapsulate it in an example here, or in a graphical example. And that's kind of what I've done here, right? I've taken this thing, this what I've called the production possibilities frontier. It's a great name for it, right? Because that's what it is. It outlines all of the possible things we might do. And I've graphed it, right? So you can see here are my points. I started at 15,0. That's when I have 15 bikes are on the y-axis, I guess. 15 million bikes, 0 smartphones. But then we move to 1 and 14, 2 and 12. I described this point for you as well. 3 and 9, so on and so forth, right? So if graphs freak you out a little bit, it's, you should always kind of just stare at it. In economics, it's good to contemplate things like, well, what's on the y-axis, what's on the x-axis. One thing we do a terrible job with, and I try to do better, is I like to, when you're talking about production, it's actually a flow, right? The unit of time matters, so that should also always be on the graph. So we see we're talking about millions per year here, right? Is kind of the idea. So one thing you might notice here is that the consequence, right, my idea that things get more costly to do, right, there is a mathematical or a graphical consequence of this. And really that consequence is that the PPF has this sort of concave to the origin shape, right? It's not a straight line. It's bowed out. So when I move from A to B, or put another way, if you wanted to be very technical about this, the slope is getting more negative, right? It's getting steeper as we move left to right. And that is kind of what you might think about as this cost problem, or this cost aspect of this. Opportunity cost, right? Giving up something to get more of something else. So you can see going from A to B, that's my, I go from 0, 15 to 1, 14, but then when I go from 0 to 2, 1 to 2, I go from 14 to 12, and that's this idea that I was talking about, these changes between the points. So, going back to that question about what I should do, we don't know yet. We just know that in all of these points along this curve, right, what I'm using my resources as much as I possibly can. Put another way, I'm using things efficiently, right? And indeed, one thing you often do with the PPF, I'm going to see if this works. Try out this bad boy. One thing you might do with the PPF here, it's kind of low, but and you know what? Is you can sort of ask what would happen if, you get some new technology, or, you can even characterize other things using the diagram here. So, can you see that at all? Not really? Yeah, I'm going to have to think of something else here. But I'll give it a try. So that's all I'm doing is drawing an X, a Y axis, just a graph. I'll put smartphones here. I'll put bikes here. I'm actually going to walk back and just see what it looks like in a second. And then my PPF kind of has a general shape like that, right? And you can fill in the numbers, so this might be 15 and 5. And we can use this to just sort of say a bunch of things about different points along the graph. So for one thing you often do is you can say a point like this, right? Maybe that coincides with 9 bikes and 2 smartphones or something like that. Well, we can say that a point like that is inefficient in the sense that, well, what we're doing here is not on our frontier. Put another way, we could be, and this kind of is nice because inefficient, what does that mean? And you might say, well, if you're inefficient, you could be doing more. What you might say when you sort of have access to this graph is you might say, well, we have a pretty clear definition of what it means to be inefficient. It means that we're at a point where we could be doing more of everything, right, with what we have. And so if we were to move in this direction, right, we would have both more bikes and smartphones, right? So an inefficient point would be one at which it's possible to do more of everything. So then, if you think about that, you can actually parlay that into a definition of, or an aspect, I'll say, of efficiency, that if we're doing things efficiently, Well, we're on the frontier. So if we want to do more of one thing, we're going to have to do less of something else, right? Because we can no longer go into this area. These points out here are unattainable, right, with our production possibilities frontier. Now, oftentimes you can even go a little bit further with this diagram, and you can think about what technological progress would look like. And maybe it's obvious, but you can talk about technologies that allow you to produce more of everything, and that would be a general expansion of the PPF. We'll talk about that in a second, right? Or differences in PPFs. And people often talk about biased technological change, and you can learn a little bit from that case as well. So, for example, you might say, what happens if a new technology comes along that allows us to produce more smartphones with more phones with, you can see my graph is a little old there, right? Nobody says that anymore. Well, that might be, you might say, well, that would mean that if we devoted everything in the factory to producing phones, we could get something like this. But an implication of this is that, well, it turns out we can produce, our whole frontier will actually shift out. We can produce more of everything if we can produce more of one thing. It's kind of interesting, right? So we get all these implications out of this pretty simple representation of the graph. Yes?
Couldn't efficiency be also measured based on how much more money you might be providing?
So yeah, I can tell everybody wants to, you want to get money, right? So that's kind of the idea, and it's exactly right. And we have said nothing about that, right? So what I've told you is that all of these points along the curve, whatever scenario you want to think about, they're all efficient points, but we have yet to think about which one to pick. But that's a great question. If we're going to bring money into it, right, that is to say we're going to think about dollars and cents here, that'll help us pick a point, which efficient point we want. And I'm going to do that in a couple minutes. Oh, here, go ahead. We'll come back to you in a second. Yes?
I just wanted to clarify. So all on the curve, each of those points represents an efficient allocation of just resources, right?
Yes, I guess you could say it that way, right? We're using, I might say we're using the resources of our factory efficiently if we're on the frontier. But and so you had a follow-up there?
When I was talking about efficiency, I was more talking about how could you make more profit for your business, whether it be double dipping in two different markets, or let's say you're cutting costs from storing products that you're not using for the device, but you could be using it to perform that type of thing.
Okay, we'll get to that. So far, and maybe this is an important point, so far we've said nothing about dollars and cents, right? We're just talking about what we could do with the factory. But when we bring that in, you'll see hopefully, obviously it's a simple example where we can't talk about everything using it, but you'll see hopefully how this works in terms of dollars and cents in a second. So actually, you know what? I'm just going to go see what this looks like. Sorry. Yeah, that doesn't look great, does it? It's hard to see. Maybe I could. Is it? Is that better?
Yeah.
Not really sure
Man.
right now because without
I'm pretty resourceful. I'll think of something. Huh.
Slide it to the side, so that way you got the space in between.
Yeah. We'll see. All right. I'll figure it out. Okay. So one thing you can do, and I guess one thing I should say here, as I'm saying the principles of increasing costs as a general principle, well, we're going to, and that's one way you might say this, right? This idea that as you do more of something, the additional costs keep going up. Well, you can actually calculate the opportunity costs as we would describe them in economics. I don't know if I formally define the concept, but hopefully you're getting a feel for what it is. you can see, for example, that the way we might think about this is, well, let's see, if we're producing 1 million phones and we move to 2 million, we would say that the cost of producing an additional 1 million phones here is 2 million bikes, right? We have to give up 2 million bikes going from 14 to 12 to get 1 million phones here. Well, if we wanted, suppose we were producing 3 million phones and we were contemplating producing 4 million. What is the opportunity cost of producing this million? Well, you can see it's actually, we go from 9 to 5 at this point, right? Once again, think about my backstory. I have a great story coming in a second, by the way. And so in this case, 1 million phones costs us 4 million bikes, right? They're getting more and more costly for the reasons that we described. So I don't want to overwhelm you with this stuff and the calculations and all that, but suffice it to say, by looking at, I guess, the slope of the curve at a point, we get a feel for this idea that costs are increasing. Okay. So once again, think about, a lot of you are probably saying, I don't care about bikes and phones, whatever, that's dumb. That's fine. But ask yourself if you changed the goods, right? If you thought about, two things that interested you, or you changed, instead of yearly production, you thought about daily production, or if you thought about not, a giant factory, but a mom and pop business, right? Do the basic principles change? I don't think they do, right? And this is one of the neat things about these simple economics examples here. But I mentioned it before, I'll mention it again. Think about those things that might actually make the example. That's actually a good question. Maybe we can start with that. Or maybe I'll leave you with that. What would make this not work the way I've described it? Anyway, we'll move on here. So this principle of increasing costs. You can use it you can think about this for all sorts of things, and we will see that, you may say, well, I thought this class would be about supply and demand. Everything I'm saying here will be critical to us for understanding supply, right? How half of a market, the typical market works. Anyways, you can think about this substitution principle. I don't know if that's what it's called here. I'm calling it that. Behind the principle of increasing costs, it's kind of evidence of the fact that this idea that people act rationally, right? So here's an example. Suppose it's your typical Sunday afternoon, and I have, a bunch of different things. On a typical Sunday, maybe I have nothing to do, just leisure time, right? Maybe I have a lot of things to do, right? So I might have to do these sort of job-related tasks. Edit a paper that I'm working on, correct some exams, make lecture notes, and comment on a thesis, right? Those theses or whatever. Those are my jobs that I might have to do on a Sunday. But there's also these leisure activities I could engage in, right? I could watch football, go fishing, bring the kids to ice fishing, I guess, the way things are going now. Bring the kids to the movies, or I could take a nap, right? That's my typical Sunday. Sounds pretty good, right? And we'll just, for simplicity, once again, you can ask if my simplifying assumptions change everything about the example. But we'll suppose that everything I've described here occupies a 3-hour block of time, right, on my Sunday, for my 12 hours of time that I can mess around with on Sunday. So let's suppose that we get a little bit deeper in the semester. I'm just going along with my normal course of things, which is all leisure, right? But now suppose it's exam time and I have to correct exams on Sunday, right? Well, the question becomes, now I can't do one of my leisure activities, right? And so then the question becomes, which one of those leisure activities do I give up, right? Well, let's see. If you were me, which one would you give up? Anybody want to volunteer an answer here?
The nap.
The nap. Why is that?
Useless.
It's useless. Oh, hey, that's a good answer.
Well, I kind of.
Does anybody else have? Yes. Well, yes.
Anything but fishing.
Okay, all right, so you don't want, no nap, no fishing,
No,
right?
no, yes, fishing.
Oh, you want to go fishing,
I
okay.
don't say good morning, I only say morning, because if it were a good morning, I'd be fishing.
Okay, good, I like that. Yeah, that's right. A bad day of fishing is better than a good day of work, right? As the old adage goes. Yes, sir?
I'd say watching football, because realistically, if you take a nap, you'd be more energized.
Because you hate the Patriots, is that what this is about? Right, okay. So, but the point is, the first thing you do, all of you, and you would do the exact same thing that I would do, you target the least valuable activity first, right? The nap was useless. Get rid of that, right? That's the first thing that's going. Make sure it's not fishing, right? Because that's what I really want to do. The very first thing you do is drop the activity you really, I don't want to do it, right? Well, so let's suppose it's just for the sake of argument, we get rid of the nap. No nap today. Well, then, I'm already grading my exams here. Suppose I have to comment on a stack of theses now, right? So now I have two things to do. I've given up my nap. What do I do next? What do I give up next to do my thesis grading? Well, now I have to, let's see, football, movies, or fishing. Well, what am I going to do? I'm going to pick out the activity that I like the least from those three and give that up, right? Maybe that's watching football, right? I think you're getting the idea as to how it goes, and hopefully I'm conveying to you that this principle of increasing costs doesn't just have to apply at a factory. It applies to the way you make your decisions, if only if it's impacting your psychology, or if you're an economist, you would say utility, right? You give up the lowest utility, the lowest satisfaction tasks first when you have to do something else. So since we messed around with IT stuff for 10 minutes, that has opportunity costs. In our case, it's figuring out what I do after I, and this is good. I don't have to decide between fishing and bringing the kids to a movie. So anyways, let's just quickly think about this other thing. We've said all this stuff about efficiency and increasing costs. We've had this persistent question about which of these points should I take? Well, the thing that we would have to do is bring in some information on the financial side here, in my case, prices. So, once we do this, it's actually fairly straightforward to figure this out. What we can do, I've sort of left costs out of this. If you'll notice, if you remember from the beginning of my example, I just said, suppose we have all this stuff to begin with. Given the presence of our raw materials and labor and all that stuff, we're producing there. So now, what we want to do is just figure out which of those points on the production possibilities frontier give us the most revenue. And so it's really pretty simple. Give me a price of a phone, right, and a price of a bike, what I sell these things for, and then we can just sort of take each of our points, multiply them out, and pick the one that has the highest revenue, right? So 15 bikes at a price of $200 gives me $3,000 in revenue. Did I do that math right? I think I did. Well, let's see, 14 bikes and 1 million phones gives me 3,500, right, at my prices. We can continue on here. 12, I'm going to try this. I don't know if it's going to work. Oh, God. 12 and 2, we'll just do it here. 12 times 2 is 24, right? 7 times 2 is 1,400. Bless you. Wait, did I mess this up? What is this? 38? Okay. Let's see, 9 times 7. 9 times 2 is 18, sorry. 3 times 7 is 21. Is that right? Okay. 5 times 4 times 7 is 28. And then 5 times 7 is 35. Okay. Oop. So you can see here that of the points that we want, of the points that that are really, we can calculate all our revenues here, and we find that this point here is the one that gives us the most revenue. So this is how we would pick among our efficient points, right? 9 and 3 would give us the most revenue. Of course, we've understood only a small aspect of the problem there that we might face as a firm. The other problem we might face is, well, we have to figure out, how we get the raw materials at least costs and all that stuff. The other thing we might also consider is that prices might be moving as we change our amounts of output. So all of these things are complications, but this is a big theme too when you're thinking about a model, right? The old divide and conquer. That's a big complex problem, dealing with costs, how much should you produce, what about prices, all this stuff. Break it into its components and think about each of those separately, right? And then you put it together. So that might be the best I can do with the questions about running a business at this point. Okay, how are we doing on time here? Pretty good, right? One thing, maybe I'll just throw this in there. I can't help myself. I know it's not great maybe to do this all the time, but I like to, I have an ulterior motive, which is to try to recruit majors for economics. And I know a lot of you are frightened by mathematics. I was too at one point. But I like to, some of you aren't, and I like to point out that there is some more mathiness to this when I can. So if you'll notice, the price of phones was what, 700? And the price of bikes was 200, right? So if you sort of think about that number, 7 over 2, what is that, 3.5? That's kind of the slope of a price line, right? And in some sense, that's a trade-off. I sell a bike, or if I don't sell a bike and I sell a phone, well, I get, I improve my revenues by, I guess, the trade-off there is 3.5. So the 9.3 point, where I'm going with this, the slope of the line right around there is very close to the slope of that price ratio, I will say. And that's no accident. And so there's a little hint that these problems can be, if you're interested in the mathematics. You don't have to know that, but thought I'd throw it out there. Okay, so the production possibilities frontier, as we've discussed it, is I guess pretty interesting, right? Maybe you're surprised, or maybe you're bored, or I don't know, tired. It's kind of early. But I think you can appreciate that we developed this kind of nice technical tool that we get quite a bit of mileage out of, right? We've been able to define some additional terms and think about general principles in a way maybe that we wouldn't without this. So the first appearance of a PPF, if I might call it that, on the scene, well, we can go back to the early 1800s here, and it was the invention of one of the 5 most famous economists of all time, David Ricardo. I don't know how many people have heard that name. You've probably all heard the name Adam Smith or Karl Marx. Right? David Ricardo is kind of right there with him. In fact, most of what Marx did economically derived from David Ricardo. If you want to learn about that stuff, you can take my 305 class. Anyway, so Ricardo was an interesting guy. There's a portrait of Mr. Ricardo. And so you can kind of see some of his life details. We like to say he was a very international guy. He lived in England, but he was a Sephardic Jew from Portugal. So he had this really nice sort of cosmopolitan background. And so maybe I have romantic notions about what he did here. He was a very successful businessman in life. And sometime in his late 20s, he picked up The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. And if you read it, it's a fantastic book. It's a little short on details at times. And Ricardo, being a businessman who was, into accounting, kind of set about making numbers that fit the story in The Wealth of Nations. And so in so doing, he built up a lot of economic theories. He was a very good friend of Malthus. You might know Malthus from, if you've ever wrestled with population dynamics or Malthusian dynamics, he created that stuff. Anyway, so one of the things he did was he created this, or the background of this idea of comparative advantage, right? Which gave him a very nice way of illustrating that everybody can gain from trade, right? And his idea was that if you take two countries out there and you take their PPFs, right, the stuff they can do with the resources in their countries, if they specialize in one thing and trade for the thing they're not so good at, right? One of the nice things about his apparatus is you get a very concrete definition of being what it means to be not so good at something. Then you can show that everybody can gain from trade. And I'm going to show you how this argument works. One of the interesting things about this is he takes our already, well, I shouldn't say he takes it, but what we're going to do is take our already simple PPF and make it even simpler, right, for the purposes of this problem. Question?
Could you define mercantilist views?
Oh, okay, mercantilist views. So, mercantilist views, well, this was the pervading kind of view of, the world economy at the time, was that everything was a zero-sum game, right? That is to say, if England exports wool to Portugal and gets money for it, that's good. But the fact that England is importing, say, wine from Portugal, well, that's bad, right? So what we want to do is limit our imports as much as possible and export as much as we possibly can to other countries, right? And so along with this went a whole set of policies that the classical economists like Ricardo and Adam Smith basically argued were counterproductive, right? That is to say, policies like tariff barriers and limiting imports. There was also all this stuff involving gold, right? We're going to talk about money later in the class. Gold, how we don't want to export things or import things because that means our gold is leaving the country. So it was all this stuff caught up in these views, and they were saying, no, in fact, it's good if we just trade as much as possible with other countries, right? And so the law of comparative advantage is that you can gain, everybody can gain, right, by specializing in producing what they do at the lowest opportunity cost. So that means you do the thing that you find easiest in a very clearly well-defined technical way. Yes?
Sorry, I have a follow-up.
Go ahead.
So would trade protectionism, with tariffs and stuff, be an example of that sort of mercantilism?
It would be, yes. Yes, and right. So you can take that. We obviously, it's kind of interesting. One of the things I talk about in my 305 class is that everything that's new is everything that's old is new again. The mercantilist arguments for protectionism keep coming back, and so making the argument for trade is important. And in any case, later in the class, we're going to sort of talk about it at a higher level, international trade theory. So it's a pretty good idea here that you'll notice that we use this lowest opportunity cost idea here, right? So the thing you want to do is the thing that has the lowest opportunity cost. So think about it this way, and you can understand kind of day-to-day activities here. There's a lot of things you can do quite easily yourself, but you don't, right? And I might even say you shouldn't. So for example, if you're a surgeon, spending a week painting your house, it's great. You might be a fantastic painter, right? Maybe you worked as in college, you painted houses for a living, so you're pretty good at it, right? So you're pretty skilled at painting houses, but painting your own house is probably a bad idea, right? Why is that the case? The opportunity costs are enormous, right? You could be going to work for a week and doing surgeries and either helping people if that's what you're interested in doing, or making an enormous amount of money, right? Even though you're good at painting houses. It might even make sense to pay someone else to do it, even though they're not as good as you are, right? At painting a house. It's not because you're lazy or anything. It's just because the opportunity costs are too high, right? What are your opportunity costs to being a surgeon? Well, they're actually kind of high in that case if you're a good painter, right? You can paint houses pretty well. but they're lower than your opportunity costs from doing surgery. We might put it that way, right? And so the way we express this idea is that what really matters is you comparing what you can do to yourself, right? Do what you can do at the lowest opportunity cost. It's kind of funny to say that, right? A surgeon doing surgeries, you'd say, oh, he's tremendously skilled. We might say, well, the opportunity costs to doing surgery are very low for this person. But there's a lot of situations where this applies, and we call this principle generally comparative advantage. I will discuss it fully in a second here in a technical way that hopefully helps you. And so, you can think about this as well in the hopefully we get to all of this. But you can think about, take an example like Long Island, which has some of the most, by any reckoning, some of the most productive farmland in the world, right? How much farming is going on in Long Island right now? Not much. Not much at all. And why is that? Well, as valuable as yes, go ahead.
It's a godless chunk of rock that Long Island is.
Well, maybe yes, there's that. But I was going to say, because the real estate is so incredibly valuable for other purposes. Yeah?
Okay, so you changed the law of comparative advantage.
Mhm.
So simplify, for myself, basically looking at less is more then. So I'm talking about less cause equal more.
You might say that. So
Less will be.
let's take a quick numerical example here, and I'm going to try to do it that way. You'll see here I have a very simple example, and we're going to forget about the bowed out shape of the PPF here. And I'm going to give you two countries with two PPFs, and we're going to think about what happens when they gain from exchange, and hopefully you can see kind of why exchange works in this example. And I know, we can back up and pick up technical details later. Let's see what this green marker looks like. Better or worse? It is better? Oh, okay. How about that? So what we're going to do, that's not so good, is we're going to graph this. Oh. It's a work in progress, right? I tend to think the red's a little better. I don't know. Okay, so I've given you some numbers here, Portugal and England, and we say in Portugal, the possibilities for production, you take the population and the land, and you say, what I'm going to say is if everybody devoted all their time to producing wine, Portugal could make 40,000 barrels. So I'll call this 40, and we'll call this wine, right? Once again, we're abstracting the two goods here to get the general purpose, the general idea across. And 20,000 tons of wool, right? So maybe that's something like this, right? And then we have a line there. I'm getting my graphing skills up and going again. Okay. So I'm just going to draw a perfectly flat line here as a PPF. It could be bowed out, but this makes things really simple because now we can just kind of look at this line and we can infer what the opportunity cost is of doing different sorts of things here, right? As an example, you can see that this line has sort of a 2/1 or a slope of -2, you might say. What do I mean by that? Well, it's sort of every time I go in this direction by a unit, I go down in this direction by 2 units, right? I said that poorly, but that's the idea. But here what we care about is that this seems to imply that every time I produce a unit of wool in Portugal, right, I'm giving up 2 wines, right? So we can even say that one wool requires 2 wines. And the nice thing, look at that's terrible, I know. But the nice thing about it is we can also flip it around and we can say 1 wool, right? 1 wine requires half a wool, right? Fair enough? Okay. Well, let's get to England here, which, could make 40 wine in a year. This is going to be, right? And 80 wool. It's a lot of wool. So my graph is not going to be completely anatomically correct, but hopefully you'll work with me here. Here's 80, right? And there's 40. So it is going to be flatter here, right? And so we can do the exact same thing. You can see here that the implication is that, well, here's wine, here's wool. I mean, I know I'm kind of, my example isn't going to be all that surprising because we're not going to have English wine in the end, right? I don't even know if is there such a thing? Yeah. Anyway, mead or something, right? Yeah, I don't know. Anyways, so, but the implication here is, once again, we can calculate out these opportunity costs. We can kind of see every time we produce a wool in England, we give up 1/2 a unit of wine, right? Every time we produce a wine, we give up 2 wool. And you know what? One thing about these numbers is when you see Baker up here, I mean, it looks like I'm struggling maybe, but it looks pretty simple when I do this, but you can, you might have to sit here and think about this a little bit to make sure you understand all the numbers. By the way, a brief little thing on this is I've learned that everybody's getting angry about AI and all that stuff. One thing I've learned from just, my kids sort of use it in different circumstances, is one really great use of AI is to just say, hey, give me 10 examples of comparative advantage in trade using a linear PPF. Something like that, right? A straight line PPF. And then you can just and then you can say, now give me 10 questions, right? Don't tell me the answers yet. And so you can sort of do a self-quiz and all that stuff. That's the good way to use AI. The bad way, well, is to say, tell me the answers, and not try to understand the principles. So you can do that, right, if this seems a little strange to you. Anyways, comparative advantage, right, and the principle, as Ricardo stated it, would suggest that each country can gain by specializing in what they do best, put another way, have low opportunity costs for doing, and then trading. So here, what we would say is, well, let's see, in Portugal, a wool costs 2 wines, right? Whereas a wine costs 1 wool. So let's just compare this, right, with this. So in Portugal, you give up 2 wines to make a wool. In England, you give up 1/2 a wine to make a wool. So England has pretty low opportunity costs for making wool then, or relatively low costs, right? So maybe England should focus on producing wool, right? The same is true for Portugal, right? If you look at Portugal, 1 wine costs 1/2 a wool. In England, a wine costs 2 wool, right? So we probably want Portugal to do the wine producing, right? I'll just circle these endpoints here. So, yes, go ahead.
This is post-globalization?
This is globalization 1810 style, yes. Okay, so you'll see here that, having calculated all of these numbers, maybe you can convince yourself that so long as these lines have different slopes across these 2 countries, different steepnesses, some country's going to have a comparative advantage in something, right? One thing I didn't mention, which I should just kind of dwell upon for 15 seconds here, is that this is even the case when England seemingly can produce more of everything, right? England's a bigger country, geographically and in terms of population. You can make both more wine and wool. Well, it's a tie in the case of wine, but it's greater than or equal to whatever Portugal can do. It has an absolute advantage, we can say, but that really has no bearing on the problem. Now, let's suppose that we now introduce, of course, the PPF stuff we talked about before is all still there. Everything that's possible in England and efficient is along this line. Everything that's possible and efficient in Portugal is along this line. So one thing we might do is if we wanted to show they gain from trade, we might want to show that somehow this changes the possibilities. And that's what Ricardo did. He said, imagine that there's a world market out there, or we allow trade between these countries, and we imagine that in the international market, a wine trades for a wool, right? A wine trades for a wool. So there's a price, right, in effect, of every time you ship your stuff to London, you have a shipload of wine. Every unit of wine you can trade for a unit of wool. If you're in England, you go down to Lisbon, and boom, you can trade your wool for 1 unit of wine. Well, just think about this conceptually, what this does for Portugal. If Portugal produces nothing but wine, and then goes to England and trades all of it for wool, at this price, how many wools can it get? Well, 40 wines each trading for 1 wool implies they could get 40 wool, right? So Portugal's PPF kind of shifts out like this, right? They can get more of both goods than they could before in a whole bunch of circumstances in here, right? So they gained, this is how Ricardo said they gained from trade. If we go to England, right? Well, let's see, England packs up all of its ships, just hypothetically, suppose that it did this, packed up all of its ships, sailed to Portugal, maybe other places too, and traded all of its wool for wine. Well, it could, in principle, it's way up here, get 80 units of wine. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, well, that's not possible because Portugal can only make 40, so, okay, I mean, maybe they trade a little bit and wind up here, right? And we have to balance books on international markets and stuff. But that's not really the point here. The point is that by specializing in what you do best and then trading, right, you get, in effect, a better trade-off in the market than you get at home, right? Here you're giving up less wool. Here you're giving up less wine to get wool than you would be if you weren't trading, right? So trade, in some sense, acts as a surrogate for better technology, right? Same over here. Everybody gains from this trade here. So that was Ricardo's basic argument. Now, he didn't talk about how much wine or wool people wanted. It turns out that in that day, back when he was doing his economics, they hadn't quite figured out how to talk about demand and all of that stuff. And that's going to be a big part of our story. How am I doing on? All right, perfect. Is that ultimately what we're going to want to do is talk about all this efficiency context, all this efficiency stuff, but also bring to bear valuation, right? That is to say, how do we think about what people actually want? Do they want bikes? Do they want smartphones? Do they want fish or coconuts, or do they want wine or wool? And once we put that together with these efficiency ideas, we're really ready to get some ideas as to how a market works. We might also say, and now I'll get a little bit provocative here, is that there are different ways to answer these questions, right? How do we decide who produces what? How much do we produce of X or Y? And then we can add in this additional aspect of it, who gets it? There's different ways to do this, right? One of which is to sort of organize all of the, just to throw out a big idea here. You might say, well, the best way to do this across our economy is to plan it all out, right? So I have an example here, housing. We could say, who needs the housing the most? How are we going to make it? What type of housing are we going to make? We can plan all that out and use our PPF. Maybe we can figure out all this stuff. Do it that way and then allocate the housing. That's one way to solve all of these problems for society, these problems of scarcity and allocation. Another way is to just let the market do it, which seems like utter chaos relative to the first thing, right? Everybody just sort of doing their own thing. Well, we're going to start to understand that maybe it isn't. And we're going to start to see how we can understand market activity using ideas like these that we've talked about in the PPF. I will leave it at that. Have a great weekend. I'll see you Tuesday. Please get started on the Top Hat stuff. Not essential, but it will be shortly. So.